Hi everyone, I've had a few requests to do a video on my airbrush backgrounds and the setup that I use. So for today's video I'll show you how I did the background of a recent wildlife painting that I finished. I haven't got around to photographing it yet, but the actual piece is finished. So you want to start off, it's all about a layering process as with any other medium, and because I'm trying to achieve a blurred, grassy, foliage type background, I've decided it would be easier to work from light to dark. So I will just mention, if you would like a full in-depth tutorial type thing where I'm explaining step by step how I use the airbrush, exactly how I'm layering, then I am setting up a Patreon channel, so that type of content will be available over there. Videos from anywhere between 1 hour and 3 hours long. So don't hesitate to drop me an email or pop it in the comments below if Patreon is of interest. So when you're starting off your layers, your main aim is to just cover the canvas with some degree of paint. So you want it to be an opaque colour, so what I've used is a white, and I've mixed a green and added that to the white to tint that colour and give me just a general base layer. I'm now drying it with my hairdryer. Now with this, obviously don't put your hairdryer too close to the canvas because you do not want to make that acrylic bubble. Acrylic is plastic, so any kind of heat will damage it. So it looks like I'm holding it closer than I actually am. Hold it a decent distance away, and I don't actually use the full heat setting on my hairdryer. So once it's fully dry, and you'll know when it's fully dry because the canvas needs to be cold, and it won't have that tacky feeling. If it's still got a tacky feeling, it means that the paint is still a bit wet. Each additional layer needs to be slightly darker than the layer before, so all I'm doing here is just working on tinting the colour, getting the colour to nearer to how I want the finished piece to be. But at the moment I'm just trying to cover the white colour of the gessoed canvas. So when I'm applying the layers, I always start with the edge first, and that is because I want that usually to be a bit darker than the face front section of the canvas. When you are mixing your paint together, you only need a few drops. I did learn that the hard way when I first started because I always mixed way too much, and only literally 4 or 5 drops of a paint and that will cover a large surface area. I personally mix it directly into the cup at the top, and I use a gravity fed airbrush. It's just my preferred airbrush to use, and it's a dual action, so I have control of the paint flow and the air pressure. Now the airbrush that you see me using here is an Infinity CR+, and the reason why I'm using it for this one is because I'm going to be using a finer needle to add the blurred grass section in the back. If you are just looking to do simple mottled blurred backgrounds, then the Iwata Neo airbrush, which has a 0.5 needle I think it is the one that I use to start off with, and that is still the airbrush I will use for my simple mottled backgrounds. It's only when I want to achieve more detail in my backgrounds that I will use this airbrush that I'm using now, because I have the ability to change a narrower, finer needle, whereas the Iwata Neo, it comes with a standard needle size and that is it. Now you will need an air source, so you will need a compressor to go with your airbrush, so it is a more costly setup, but once you have committed to that and you've learned how to use it, the airbrush is invaluable. I love it and I would never want to be without it when I'm working with my acrylics. So the closer you hold the airbrush to the canvas, the sharper your lines and your details will be. The further away you hold it, the more blurred effect you will create. That is why absolute beginners who have never picked up an airbrush before can achieve really nice backgrounds without any kind of experience with using it. You're not trying to add loads of detail, so it doesn't require any, that technical skill that you might have to practice and practice and practice. Because you're only trying to achieve a blurred background, an absolute beginner can pick it up and create a beautiful background on their artwork. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do go into this far more in depth on my Patreon channels, which I am going to be starting up very soon. So that talks you through the exact process, how much pressure, how much paint I'm letting through, and slowing down each process. And I will explain the colours that I'm using, why I'm using those colours, and how I layer to create different types of backgrounds and different types of effects that you want to create. So one big tip is when you are using your airbrush, try and hold it parallel to your canvas. I have on many occasions tipped paint onto my canvas because I've tilted it forward. Now it is a little bit more trickier for me to do this with this round canvas because I've actually had to tilt back my easel so that the round canvas didn't keep sliding down the bit of MDF there that I've put there, so that I don't get any major overspray on my board. But yeah, don't be tempted to tilt your hand forward because your paint will come out of your cup and it will tip onto your canvas. Now what I've done, once you've got your outline on your canvas, which I've just used transfer paper for this, as you've seen in my other acrylic tutorials, I've mentioned many times why I use that for my acrylics and how I get my outlines on my canvases. So what I'm doing now is I've actually changed and put a narrower needle into my airbrush so that I can create some more detail to my background. It's still blurry, but it's achieving a much more precise action. So the ability with this airbrush, which I also like, is you can control there's an attachment at the back, and you can actually control even more so how much paint comes out at one time. So it's really good for this precision type of backgrounds, which I haven't actually tried doing yet with this airbrush. It is on my to-do list. I just need to pick a subject and what I want to paint and the background, the complex background I want to do with an airbrush. So that is on my to-do list. So all I'm trying to do now is build up on my depth. I'm putting in where my lights are. I'm going to go in and put in some of where my midtones and darker shades are, just to create that look of distant blurred grass. Now what you saw before I started working on the canvas here, to the side I was spraying some paint, and that's purely because I wanted to make sure that the fresh colour that I just mixed, which was a little bit different than the lighter shade I put down, was the colour that was coming out of my airbrush. Because what will happen is, if you've just mixed a fresh colour, that colour that you were previously using may still be within the nozzle of the airbrush. So take it to the side, squirt it on a little bit of spare MDF or whatever you've got, like what I'm doing here, just to make sure that the colour that you're actually mixing is the one that's coming out on the canvas. So all I'm doing now is just refining it. I'm just adding in some subtle differences in tone, making sure I'm creating depth with each layer that I add. And as with anything else, acrylics is very forgiving. If you make a wrong layer, just go over it. It's absolutely fine. Now of course what you can do this background as I'm doing without putting your subject on first. That's that's how I often work. However, because of this, I wanted to make sure that the grass was in specific areas in relation to the bird. That's the only reason why I put my outline on first, and I'm now reworking around that. If you do decide to do it this way, the biggest tip I can give you is you can notice how my airbrushed sections that I'm working on overlap my sketch. That's really important because you don't want a halo around your subject. You want these lines, these grass blurred lines, to meet up with the subject, not to have a gap between the background and the subject, because it will look like a sticker and it will look like your subject's just been stuck on the front of the canvas. Now a really big thing that's really important if you are going to go and buy an airbrush, or if you are airbrushing, is please make sure you get a good face mask. It's really, really important that you don't breathe in this airbrush paint. Now if it lands on your furniture, on your easel, it does no problem. It's just more like a dust. Just rub it off and it wipes off really, really easily. But you don't want to be breathing this paint in because of how fine the particles are. It will, coat your nose and the inside of your lungs potentially. So just take the precautions with a good face mask that is proven to work against really fine particles. You don't want one that you're wearing a face mask but it's not doing a job, so make sure it's a good one that can get the finest of particles. Now the good thing with working with an airbrush is once you've got your subject and you think that you're pretty much there with your finished painting, you can go back with your airbrush and overlap on top of your normal standard acrylics and tweak a background, or if you want to blur out a part of your subject, you can use your airbrush back over your acrylic paint. If you're using oil paints, obviously because this is a water-based medium, you can't mix those. You can put an acrylic base down first, but you can't put your acrylics back over your oils. So bear that in mind because it will not be archival. Now this background is 80% complete. Once you've got it to that stage, I tend to then block in your subject because I never am happy really with my airbrush background until I've got my subject in. I find it really hard to judge. What I'm doing here, I've got a white charcoal pencil and I'm just going over my sketch just so that I don't lose the main shape of the bird and where the legs are. This is just a good habit to get into because you spend all that time freehanding your outline and then you put it on your canvas. You just don't want to then have to repeat that process again. The reason why I'm reinforcing those lines is because I'm going to go in and just darken this shadow here. This process was not needed because I actually went back and lightened this area because I didn't like it. And this is what I mentioned before about why I only get my backgrounds to about 80% complete. It's purely because most of the time, once I've got my subject in, I need to change my airbrush background slightly anyway because it's better to judge how far back and how much detail you actually want to capture. Now this pot here is what you can use to change your airbrush colour without having to spray a load of paint in the atmosphere and in the room that you're working in. If you put the end of your airbrush in that pot, you can actually spray directly into that so that none of the paint goes into your studio and you're not breathing that in. If this video was of use, I would really appreciate if you gave it a thumbs up. It really does help, and subscribe and hit the bell button so you get notified of new content. So you can see that it is all a layering process just like everything else, and like I say, if you do a bad layer it really doesn't matter, just go straight over it. Just make sure as well you just paint the edges of your canvas, because the amount of times I haven't done that, I've got the background as I want it and then I've realised I've got to get my airbrush back out just to do the edges. That's very frustrating because then you've got to try and colour match and get the exact colour. So try and make sure you get into the habit of doing the edges of your canvas first. Obviously if your pieces are being framed, the edges are irrelevant, but like with a canvas like this, these are meant to be hung straight on the wall, so you want to make sure that your edges are completely covered. This painting took hours. Drawing birds has got to be one of the most time-consuming subjects to draw. All the feathers. My husband asked me to paint this, and I regretted it soon after. The amount of detail and the work in the feathers. But anyway, I will be making a video of that shortly. But I do hope this video was of use, just giving you the brief information, some tips and advice, and especially about a mask and the health and safety side of it. It's really important. So I hope this was useful, and as always I'd like to hear your feedback in the comments below. If there's any other content you want me to make, any focus videos of specific topics, then pop that in the comments below as well. Thank you, bye!